Frank Mankiewicz was born in 1924 and passed away yesterday. He is, of course, the father of Ben Mankiewicz, who helped found the Young Turks. And he's also a great, great American. Now, a lot of people say that when people die, but as you're about to see in the story that I'm going to tell you, in this case, it was absolutely true. So Frank was born to Herman Mankiewicz, who was his father and wrote Citizen Kane, and lived a magical life when he was a kid. The Marx Brothers would come over to his house. They'd have Seder dinner together. The Greta Garbo would come over, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Basically, he could have done anything he wanted in Hollywood. And once he was asked, why didn't you? Why did you go into politics and journalism and media? Why didn't you just stay in Hollywood? He said, whenever they came over to the house, all they would talk about is clothes and money. Two things I did not care about. I wanted to do something relevant with my life. Oh, I love Frank. And so he decided that he was going to go and study. So he went to UCLA undergrad, and then he went to Columbia for journalism school, and then went to Berkeley for law school, became a lawyer and a journalist. But along the way, something happened. That was World War II. So he went and fought the Nazis. And I once asked him about that, and I said, was it scary? Do you know if you killed any Nazis? Isn't that interesting, right? Well, he was in the Battle of the Bulge, very significant, and was there for a long time in Europe. He said, no, I don't know, because we were scared out of our minds. I remember, he said, running through the woods and firing like this. And he said, I don't know if I hit anybody. I don't know if I wanted to hit anybody. All I knew was we were all trying to fight there to remain alive, right? See, out of that story, I got something very important, which is, look, bravery is not having fear. It's overcoming that fear. And so every day as they fought the Battle of the Bulge and they ran through literally the woods, fighting the Germans, the Nazis, etc., they had to overcome that fear and show great bravery. And of course, Frank did that, and they won that war. And when he came back, instead of going down more of that path, he decided to go in the opposite path and join the Peace Corps. So he was the head of the Peace Corps in Peru, and then eventually became the head of the program in Latin America. Eventually, when he was briefing Robert F. Kennedy for his visit down to Latin America, Kennedy decided that he really liked him and wanted to work with him. And eventually he became Bobby Kennedy's press secretary. And that is when they ran that fateful 1968 campaign. And as you guys might remember, Robert Kennedy was on his way to winning the Democratic primary and likely could have been the next president of the United States. But things took a terrible turn in Los Angeles, where he was assassinated. And what a lot of people might remember Frank most for, unfortunately, is when he had to announce that death. Remember this.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968. With Senator Kennedy, at the time of his death, were his wife, Ethel, his sisters, Mrs. Stephen Smith, Mrs. Patricia Lawford, brother-in-law, Mr. Stephen Smith, his sister-in-law, Mrs. John F. Kennedy. He was 42 years old.
Frank was obviously very shaken at that moment, and he was with Kennedy when he was shot. He thought at first that it was firecrackers, and then because of the screaming, he realized that something terrible had happened. Now, that changed the trajectory of the entire nation, but it also changed the trajectory of Frank's life. If they had won, which is entirely possible, he would have gone on to an important post at the White House, and he was a massive liberal, and he would have pushed for the country to go in a better direction. He was very much opposed to the Vietnam War, but that didn't happen. Now, most people at that point could have said, well, that was a pretty good life already and a lot of accomplishments. But Frank decided, no, let's fight on. So he joined the improbable campaign of George McGovern in 1972. And that's when they said, you're crazy. There's no way McGovern can make it through the primaries. It's impossible. How do I not love a guy who took on an impossible task? And of course, they won. They won the primaries. Partly because of what happened in Wisconsin, which was an early primary state back then, and Hunter S. Thompson wrote a very famous book about this, which I read. And what they decided to do was, hey, you know what? While nobody's looking, we're going to work harder. That's the trick to any magic trick, is that you put a lot of work into it. And they put ground troops in Wisconsin, and they knocked on every door they could. And they won in districts that Muskie and the others were absolutely, positively supposed to win. Why? Because they tried. And after the massive upset in Wisconsin, they went on to rout the others and win the nomination. Now, afterwards, they lost to Nixon in a famous landslide, partly because they'd picked Eagleton to be the VP candidate, and Frank Mankiewicz blamed himself, of course, for that, as all responsible people do. He was part of the selection committee. But what I found out today, which I did not know until today, is that it turns out Frank had pushed for Walter Cronkite initially. And they thought that that was too out of the box. Well, if it turns out if they'd picked Walter Cronkite, you might have had a completely different election at that point. So once again, after the McGovern campaign and that miraculous win in the primaries, you could have called it a day, but not Frank. He then went on to form or become head of NPR. Now, he was head of NPR for 6 years, 6 incredibly important years. Let me go to the Washington Post here to give you a quote for what happened then. Mr. Mankiewicz took over National Public Radio in 1977. The outfit was so obscure at the time that he had never listened to a broadcast, he said. And his mandate was to use his political connections and publicity skill to raise the organization's profile. During his 6 years at the helm, the NPR news department more than doubled and listenership nearly tripled. He helped start the popular new program Morning Edition in 1979. Now, in 1980, Ronald Reagan comes in, budget cuts start to take massive effect. By the time that Frank leaves at the end of his 6 years, all of his obituaries mentioned that they had run into significant deficit issues, partly because of the cuts and partly because of other things. But you know what? In those 6 years, he built NPR into what you know and love today. If he had not acted boldly and decisively, they would not have doubled their news departments, they would not have tripled their listenership, and they would not be the NPR they are today. So the fact that Frank did that was an enormous gift to the American people, and a gift that keeps on giving to this day. He then went on to become a columnist, author of several books about Richard Nixon. In fact, not only was he on Nixon's enemies list, but he was near the top. It's not a bad distinction either. And he went on to work in PR as well. In fact, he did PR for Oliver Stone's movie JFK. And there's the story of how Robert Novak, a right-wing columnist, actually ravaged the movie before he even saw it. And he wrote a scathing piece about it, which Frank was a little upset about. Then Novak wanted to go see the premiere. And they said no. And he showed up anyway. He said, I'm Robert Novak, I'm famous. Shows up at the door and the person says, I'm sorry, you don't have an invite. He says, tell Frank, he knows Frank's running it, tell Frank Bob Novak is here. And they say, okay, sure. Frank comes out and says, hey, Bob, how you doing? He says, good. He says, all right, now let me in. He says, oh, so sorry, Bob. You had to get on the list ahead of time, and there's just no seats left. And Novak says to him, Frank, I thought you were smarter than this. And he responds, wrong again, Bob. And that's where that story comes from. And everybody loved his wit and his tenacity. And one thing I have to say about the Washington Post headline on Frank today that I didn't love is that they described him as a Washington insider. Yes, everybody in Washington knew him. He once famously said, I know everybody in Washington, half of them owe me a favor, and the other half I owe. But that's not what defined Frank. In fact, I would say that the whole Mankiewicz family is known as outsiders, and I'll tell you why. Herman Mankiewicz wrote Citizen Kane, which challenged the most powerful guy in the country at the time. Now, he used to go to his mansion and be part of all the cool parties. After he wrote Citizen Kane, he was kicked out of all those parties. He wasn't in the club anymore. That took tremendous courage for Herman Mankiewicz to do that. Then Frank Mankiewicz could have lived a Hollywood lifestyle, but he didn't. Instead, he chose outsiders like McGovern and did brave fights to make sure that they got as far as they possibly could. And then he established NPR, which is one of the few sources of real journalism in this country that continues to challenge the government. And then, of course, his son, Ben Mankiewicz, helped found the Young Turks, and we tried in our own limited way to continue that legacy. And Most of all, though, for Frank, and what I loved about him was that he was his own man. He knew exactly who he was. He knew exactly what he wanted to fight for. He wasn't going to be talked out of it. And he did the best he could in going forward. And every time I met him, I thought he was a man of tremendous confidence. And it was heartening to see. And I want to leave you with one last quote from Frank. It's when Bobby Kennedy had brought in his first child and wanted to show it off to the office, and he brought it to Frank. And then the Washington Post explains. Bobby went over to Frank's desk, held up the baby, and said, "Frank, say hello to Dougie. He's just finished reading Camus." Frank laughed, and without missing a beat, he said, "Senator, that's fabulous. You and Dougie have to meet Ben. He's just finished reading the complete works of Shakespeare." And he continued, "And next week, he's going to read it all again, right side up." Frank was one of those guys who was a truly great man. He knew what he wanted to fight for and fought for it every single day. And that is why we will all miss him dearly. He is survived by Josh Mankiewicz of Dateline News, Ben Mankiewicz of Turner Classic Movies, and the Young Turks. 8 beautiful step-grandchildren, and 1 grandchild from Ben, Josie, who we will all take care of going forward. Frank, thank you for a life well lived.